Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Kalman Andrassi, and this is the latest video for family and marriage issues. And today we're going to be talking about becoming a parent and raising children in the context of family. So, in 1980, Levine introduced the notion of there being three universal parenting goals that all parents try to achieve. The first is ensuring the physical health and the survival of their children. I think that goes without saying. Second, developing behaviors for economic maintenance. And third, developing behaviors for maximizing cultural values like morality, prestige, and achievement. So the idea there is that as a parent, you are supposed to introduce your children to the general concepts of how to survive in the broader social world, both economically and socially. That being said, cultural values also happen to influence parenting to a pretty significant degree, and we can talk a little bit about this as we move forward. But as an example, in the United States, one big value that is given a lot more emphasis than in a lot of other cultures is the idea of separating children from their parents, raising your children to be able to go off and live their lives independent of the influence of their parents. Okay? There have been a few recent trends that have been identified in developed and developing countries that reflect the general universal trends that parents are expected to kind of abide by. People and institutions other than the parents are far more involved in raising children. This includes things like schools and other different types of institutions like that. Parents are increasingly expected to provide a degree of parental permissiveness and allow their children some degree of independence so that they can develop without necessarily too much of an authoritarian or even authoritative approach to rearing the children. And of course, higher value is placed on boys rather than on girls in a lot of societies as well. And this has a lot to do with some of the historical context that we've provided in previous videos that examine some of the gender roles within society. Now, that all being said, we come to the topic of socialization, which is the process of acquiring cultural values and the types of skills that are necessary to be able to function in society. We're going to look at three different perspectives here. We're going to start with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud used an approach known as psychoanalysis, and that emphasized the interaction of different parts of the human psyche, the id, the ego, and the superego. You can learn all about that in a psychology class, but essentially looking at the actions that by which we derive pleasure and the mechanisms that are in place to control and limit those types of activities and actions. But basically, Sigmund Freud argued that the first stage, basically from about being 1 year to birth to being about 1 year old, is the oral stage, where children mostly experience the world through their mouths. They are feeding, they are having their teeth begin to grow in, and everything kind of revolves around the mouth. From about 1 year to about 3 years old, you enter what is known as the anal stage. That's where, the children are beginning to take control of their own bodies. Oftentimes potty training, learning to use the bathroom, comes during this period. Freud believed that if parents pushed too hard, it would result in children becoming what is known as anal retentive, where they tend to be very focused on order and organization and things like that, versus being anal expressive, where perhaps the parents didn't push enough to toilet train the children, and they would be a lot more lax and unorganized, but also potentially more generous as a result of that. Next comes the phallic stage, which is basically from about 3 years old to about 6 years old, where oftentimes, I mean, the big thing that Freud emphasized here was that little girls would tend to gravitate towards their fathers, and little boys would tend to gravitate more towards their mothers during this period. From about 6 years on, there's a latent stage. That's where a lot of basic cognitive development begins to manifest. And then the final stage, Freud referred to as the genital stage, which basically started with puberty and went into adulthood. And that is where children would begin to form relationships with individuals of the other sex during that period, and oftentimes start to develop their initial sexual relationships and things like that, which would lend themselves to moving on into adulthood and living the rest of your lives. Jean Piaget, meanwhile, is a Swiss psychologist and thinker. And Piaget focused on a theory known as cognitive development, which is a little bit different from Freud and emphasizes different elements of mental development. So it begins with the sensory motor stage, which begins at birth, moves on to about 2 years old, where infants start to learn about the world through their senses and their actions, not just necessarily the mouth, as Sigmund Freud suggested. Understanding concepts like object permanence, that objects exist even when they aren't seen, and things like that. Just initial recognition of the place that the child exists within the world, and that objects exist beyond that which they are immediately able to see. Then came the pre-operational stage from about 2 years old until about 7. Children start to use, symbols and language. They tend to be very intuitive in their approach to thinking, perhaps a little bit egocentric. And they tend to struggle to see things from different perspectives. It's very black and white thinking during that stage. From about 7 to 11 years comes the concrete operational stage, where basically children start to become a little bit more logical in their thinking. They start to understand concepts like conversation, and things like that. And then from about 12 years and on comes the formal operational stage, where usually children in their adolescence begin to think abstractly. They begin to be able to think hypothetically, and they start to be able to exercise logic in their ways of understanding the way that the world operates. Okay, and the last group of thinkers that we're going to be looking at are Charles Horton Cooley and George Herbert Mead. They kind of merge together a little bit. Cooley mostly emphasizes what is known as the looking glass self, and then Mead talks about symbolic interactionism and certain stages of self-development in the development of the concept of I and me, which I'll discuss here in a little bit. But let's start with Cooley here. So he talks about the looking glass self and posits that our self-concept is based on the way that we perceive ourselves, right? We imagine our appearance to others. We imagine the other people's judgment of our appearance. And from that, we develop sort of a sense of self-feeling, whether it be pride or shame or what have you. And ultimately, it is social interaction that acts as the mirror by which we're able to come up with this view of ourselves. So then George Herbert Mead talks about, again, this concept of symbolic interactionism and the I and the me. So basically, Mead proposes that the self has two aspects. There is the I, which is the spontaneous, impulsive aspect of ourselves, and the me, which is the socialized, reflective aspect, kind of based on what Cooley was talking about, right? So Mead sort of emphasized the importance of kind of taking the role of the other in social interactions where individuals, they try to imagine themselves from another person's perspective. And, that leads to stages of self-development, imitation, play, and games and things like that. People, particularly children, they take on different roles and try to understand social expectations through simulated experience. And eventually, with the concept of symbolic interactionism, people really begin to understand the world around them through symbols and shared meanings that kind of shape the social interactions that we have and the understanding of the world around us, basically. Okay, so these are some of the basic ideas as to how socialization works. But, as you kind of can imagine, it's all about starting off at sort of a base level and slowly building the skills and the values that we utilize in a meaningful manner within society. Okay? Now, some of the agents of socialization, how do we build these skills? How do we get these values? Well, the first and perhaps the most important place where that begins would be family members. So, an individual's mother and father or other members of the family tend to significantly influence their behaviors and the values that they take on. In fact, individuals that tend to be raised with certain values and certain perspectives tend to maintain those values. If you're raised in a household that, for example, is more politically conservative, chances are you will wind up being more politically conservative. And if you're raised in a house that is more liberal politically, you tend to wind up a little bit more liberal in most cases. Now, of course, there are plenty of instances where children reject the perspectives of family members, but by and large, that is sort of the reality. Of course, schools and childcare, we talked about some of those institutions that could potentially be influencing how children grow up. Schools and childcare programs are two of those different institutions. A lot of schools tend to emphasize non-academic elements of social development like citizenship and things like that in the context of their academic curricula. And of course, childcare programs as well. Children interacting with other children oftentimes tend to build a sense of self and a sense of social interaction by the way in which they wind up interacting with other children. Peer group relationships, your friends and the individuals that influence you on a day-to-day basis, even not necessarily those that you would consider to be your friends, but a lot of children associate themselves with certain other children, and they see the behaviors of other social and peer groups around them, and either accept certain elements of the behaviors that they're seeing or reject those elements. I know growing up, I kind of looked at the different types of people on the playground. It's like, okay, these are the kinds of people that I want to associate with. These are the kinds of people I don't want to associate with, and here's the reasons why, right? Toys and games socialize children, right? Historically, male children have been given things like army men or various types of sporting equipment as toys, whereas girls are often given dolls and toys of that nature, which kind of emphasize gender roles and different things like that. So that is another way that certain types of societal values are emphasized just by the types of toys and the types of games that children play um, in the whether it be in the schoolyard or otherwise. And of course, mass media, right? And we certainly cannot downplay the influence of mass media, particularly uh, in our contemporary times here. Mass media, whether they be, cartoon shows that children watch, or other types of television or other types of uh, online programming, those are going to influence how children wind up perceiving the world and how they interact with other people. Okay? Now, Cohn in 1959 examined social class as a major indicator of how children wind up being socialized. So, depending on the amount of monetary wealth available to children through their parents, this is something that influences things like the quality of schooling they receive, the types of neighbors and friends that they have, what type of clothing they wear, the types of toys and how many toys they wind up having access to, and the different types of hobbies and just general enrichment that they have access to. And what Cohn found was that lower income individuals tended to favor obedience and order versus higher income individuals that valued concepts like creativity and ambition and independence in their children. Okay? Now, race and ethnicity also play a role in socialization, and to another degree, I suppose, gender as well. But emphasizing race and ethnicity here, minority cultures do tend to differ from the majority. And that's usually with regard to aspects like religion, medicine, the degree of family ties that are available, the sense of family obligation that exists, gender roles, strictness versus permissiveness in child rearing, and differences between, perceptions of individuality versus group cooperation. How important is it that, somebody separate and individuate, as is often the case in, majority U.S. culture versus more of a social cooperative feel to, making sure that the family remains strong and can survive. So minority parents tend to teach children about their cultural heritage, but also some of the negative aspects of being in the minority, such as prejudice and discrimination, and essentially what to anticipate from society being part of the minority. Now, as far as parenting styles and practices, so children tend to exhibit characteristics of competence raised by parents who are demanding, but also warm and receptive to their children. So the most successful children tend to be in those families that are warm and receptive and accepting of their children, but also who place some degree of demands upon them and holding them accountable for their actions. So we have three different categories of parenting styles here. We have authoritative, permissive, and authoritarian. So authoritative parenting styles are when parents guide with compassion, but also establish limits and boundaries on the behaviors of their children. This tends to result in some of the most successful children. Permissive parenting styles are when very few demands are placed on the child and they're not typically held accountable for the actions that they take part in. This oftentimes leads to very competitive and impulsive children. And then authoritarian styles tend to be very strict and punitive with less of a communication and oftentimes less warmth. And again, this tends to raise children that are very much focused on obedience um, and perhaps do not necessarily exhibit some of the same levels of creativity or curiosity that some of these other parenting styles might result in. So now let's shift gears and talk a little bit about motherhood. So, in Western societies, women tend to raise their children far more independently and with a degree of isolation than in a lot of other cultures around the world. Now, that being said, motherhood is a very powerful identity here in the United States. And it's argued that it carries more power than a person's marital status or their occupation. And women generally tend to report greater meaning in their lives than do child-free women. So, many women find taking care of children more meaningful than paid work, but with that comes, unfortunately, greater stress and depression. And, you can kind of contrast this with non-Western societies where there's a lot more of an influence of the broader society in raising the child, a lot more extended family connections, and the influence of other family members than just the mother and the father, but also a lot more of a communal approach to raising children as well. Now, as for some parenting context, the traditional nuclear family, which was sort of the most dominant approach following the industrialization of the United States and I guess the rest of the world. It's this approach that has the mother and the father, and then an average of about two children that are being raised by those two individuals. In more recent times, a lot more non-traditional families have started to change the social context of parenting. Single parenthood has become far more common. Homosexual couples raise children. Sometimes parents are out of the picture and grandparents wind up raising the children. Oftentimes there are step parents through remarriage that are responsible for being involved in the raising of children. Cohabitating couples, people living together without being married, are far more common, and they can have children as well. And then, of course, there are extended families in some circumstances that also are deeply involved in the parenting of children, far more than would have been the case, in the previous decades. Another interesting concept is teen parenthood. So, teenagers having children between the ages of 15 and 19 years old is far less common, actually, than it used to be. So, in about 2015, about 300,000 teenagers wound up having children, which was a significant decline from the 1990s. And if we look at the charts here, we have a comparison of 2015 to 1991. You see just across the board a very precipitous drop in teenage pregnancy rates, which in general is seen as a good thing because teenage parents have much lower access to resources, tend not to get an education, therefore have lower incomes, which leads to higher stress and a lot more problems with raising children in general. But in 2024, teen parenthood hit a record low of 12.7 births per 1,000, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So, that's on average lower than any of the categories except for Asian and Pacific Islander in this graph here, which is again seen as generally a positive thing in modern society. But of course, take that as you wish. It was far more common in pre-industrial society for teenage individuals to have children. So there's always a pro and a con attached to things like that. Anyway, moving on to the types of policies that exist in the United States regarding families. We're going to start with family allowances, and a little bit further down, we're going to talk about family and medical leave. But to start with family allowances, the United States is one of the very few countries that does not provide any type of family allowance. Family allowances being benefits that are given by the government to families with children. So many European countries have pretty much had these benefits in place since the early 1900s, just giving monetary and other assistance to families that have children. The one thing that the United States does have is the earned income tax credit system, which provides some tax incentives to low-income families with children. So a total of 88 countries provide family allowances, and families may also receive cash benefits or tax credits. And some of the examples of that would be birth grants, where if you give birth to a child, you receive some money. School grants, money provided to provide schooling to the children once they get to the appropriate age for that. Child care allowances, so that's parents can go and work jobs to be able to take care of their children. Adoption benefits, receiving some funding if you adopt children. Some supplements for single parents. I believe France in particular has a very generous single parent supplemental system. Guaranteed minimum support benefits, allowances for adult dependents and disabled children. All these things exist in many parts of the world. And coverage is generally extended from the time of birth to the age of majority. Now, if you have disabled children, of course, that sometimes extends beyond the age of majority, whatever that might be. I think in the United States, it would be considered to be 18 years old. And of course, that varies from country to country. Let's look at some of the costs here associated with raising children. Housing is the largest expenditure at 29% of the costs associated with raising children. Food is the next highest at 18%, followed by child care and education. Now, here in the United States, child care costs can be quite exorbitant, particularly in places like California and the Los Angeles area. So it can be even higher than that in some places. Transportation's at about 15%, healthcare 9%, miscellaneous costs at about 7%. So that's, perhaps fun and other expenditures like that. And then clothing is about 6% as well. Now, the concept of remaining child-free. So nearly a third of women aged 30 to 34 do not have children, right? So 1 in 3. And almost 1 in 5 women between the ages of 35 and 39 do not have children, so about 20%. 15% of women from 40 to 44 have no children, and most childless women share the same characteristics. They oftentimes are employed, and the reasons for remaining child-free are varied, but there is sort of a cost-benefit analysis that oftentimes takes place with regard to that. Infertility is another issue with regard to having children. Infertility is the inability to get pregnant after 1 year of trying, and both men and women can be infertile. There are many different reasons behind it, oftentimes generally health-related. But a lot of medical technology has now become available for infertile couples, including in vitro fertilization, where eggs are surgically removed from the woman and then fertilized by the sperm of the male and then implanted back into the female. You have assisted reproductive technology, which is pretty much anything that deals with the egg and sperm being handled. And there are some other options as well. Surrogacy and adoption. Surrogacy is where a woman gives birth for another person or a couple, and then the couple adopts or takes legal custody of the child. And adoption in general is when you have a child that is not yours that you bring into the family, and that can be either through licensed agencies or private parties. So either you're going to get, attorneys and social workers involved in the process, or you're going to directly adopt between the birth mother and the adoptive parents. An interesting fact is that in 2016, American parents adopted 5,400 foreign children, which is a fairly large number as well. So adoptions can be closed, where the information about the birth parents is sealed and unavailable. It can be semi-open, where information exchange can take place through social workers or attorneys, or it can be open, where there's direct contact between the biological parents and the adoptive parents and children. Now, childbirth itself. So in about 1900, about half of births occurred in a hospital. And by 1970, nearly all births occurred in hospitals. And then there was a little bit of a social shift in the 1980s, where there was a bit of a resurgence of different types of childbirth. Women oftentimes choosing to give birth at home or at places outside of hospitals, oftentimes assisted by trained midwives. Now, parenthood itself can be potentially challenging. New parents are often shocked by the amount of work it takes to take care of an infant, right? Waking up, sometimes on the hour, every hour, to feed the child and other things like that. So about 40 to 70% of parents experience stress, conflict, or a decline of marital satisfaction after childbirth. So it's not all peaches and cream and roses, right? And of course, there are some traditional sex differences as well that oftentimes play into a lot of the stress. Fathers are historically seen as the family's provider, and mothers are seen as, the individuals that are supposed to be with their child. But more recently, in the last 100 years or so, there's been a lot greater shift of women going into the workplace and having a career. And of course, that is going to lead to, again, a lot of potential stress and conflict as well, where now it becomes an issue of, where does the child go for child care, and who takes care of the child, and all these other concerns start to arise. All right, and with that we come to, as I talked about earlier, policies related to childbirth itself, and in particular family and medical leave. And this is going to be the last slide here. So only about 12% of women in the United States workforce have some form of family leave. And 1 in 4 women return to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, right? And my wife's best friend in college did exactly that. In France, women receive several months of maternity leave as well as additional benefits, right? So that's kind of a contrast to what takes place here. And so, American women are often compelled to choose between work and family, as the United States has the least generous maternity and family leave policy of any developed nation. That being said, in 1993, U.S. Congress passed the Family Medical Leave Act, which forces employers with 50 or more employees to provide 12 weeks of unpaid leave to employees to care for themselves or immediate family members. Now, note that is unpaid leave. So individuals are allowed to take days off from work, but they're not going to be paid for it the way they would for paid time off. And of course, employers in small firms are not required to have this policy, right? So, a lot of different countries in the world provide paid leave so that mothers and oftentimes fathers as well can take some time off from work. And it's often many, many weeks to several months, as we talked about with the example of France. And the reality is that no such thing exists here in the United States, so it is not always very easy for parents to be able to establish those initial bonds with their children. And the unfortunate reality is that that can potentially have some, uh, can lead to issues in terms of the child's development and their general health. Um, the infant mortality rate, for example, in the United States tends to be higher than it is in parts of the world that have uh, paternity and maternity leave available for parents. So there's a lot that the United States could potentially consider. Perhaps changes in policies, or perhaps the culture of the United States is such that it would prefer to emphasize the importance of work and the importance of productivity, even over childbirth and having some of these policies in place to benefit individuals for having children. So, that's something to begin to contemplate. And I'm always interested in seeing any perspectives, so feel free to leave a comment in the comment section about your perspectives on that. But with that, that is going to be it as far as this video. I look forward to having you in the next one. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day.